Hi everyone, thanks for signing on today to our Growing Manchester Urban Trees webinar with special guest Paul Seavey, who he led the introduction to the beekeeping webinar a couple of weeks ago. I'm Emily from a social enterprise called Sow the City. We're based in Manchester, but we work all across Greater Manchester. And this webinar is part of a programme we run, which is funded by the NHS called Growing Manchester. The aims of this project are to improve access to sustainable food in Manchester and increase the health and well-being of the wider community. We've run webinars on all sorts of different topics over the last 9 weeks, keeping chickens, getting growing and setting up your own community groups, foraging, food poverty mapping. It's been a really great way for us to continue to engage with people while we're not able to meet for community sessions. So you can find recordings of most of our webinars on Vimeo. And if you want a bit more information or a PDF copy of any of the presentations, just send me an email on info@sowthecity.org. So this week, as mentioned, we have guest speaker Paul Seavey on again, talking about trees in urban areas. Individual trees, woodlands, hedgerows and orchards all form part of the fabric of our towns and cities. Manchester apparently has 23,000 street trees on roadsides, verges and in pavements, and 190 hectares of woodland in parks, open spaces and river valleys, not to mention all the trees on private land in gardens and allotments. Unfortunately, as some of our mature trees become diseased, damaged and past their prime, or due to their roots damaging pavements or their branches and leaves getting in the way, they're often replaced with easier to manage, smaller decorative species with limited benefit for wildlife. All the more reason to grow your own trees in gardens and yards to help out local birds and invertebrates if you have the space. Just one thing I wanted to mention, I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of the prestigious Manchester poplar, one of the UK's rarest native trees, propagated from the black poplar. Its connection with Manchester originates in the 19th century. It was found to be one of the few trees that could cope with the smoky, polluted air of the city. There are now only 7,000 of these across the UK and 3,000 are in Manchester. They're especially beneficial for bird life, woodpeckers, tree creepers in particular. Their numbers have declined in recent years due to disease. It's a beautiful native species. Please look out for these huge towering trees, many in green spaces near the Mersey in South Manchester, and the closest to the city centre is in St John's Gardens just off Deansgate. So I'd just like to pass over to Paul now, who'll talk through some more native tree species, the benefits of trees in urban settings, and how to grow and select tree species.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so my name's Paul Seavey. As Emily mentioned, I do a variety of things, including beekeeping, but really today's focus obviously is on trees, and my love of trees, like many people, started when I was young. My dad worked in forestry, so he used to take me out and teach me about trees and about identifying different trees, species from their leaves, from their fruit in wintertime. And, my appreciation of trees really has only grown over the years. I also work with wood, so I have a great appreciation of different types of wood that come from trees. And then in my 20s, I spent a couple of seasons working in a native tree nursery in Northern Ireland for Conservation Volunteers Northern Ireland, which then was a branch of BTCV, now called TCV. And there we promoted the planting and growing of native trees. We're involved in the Millennium Tree Campaign to plant 1 million trees to mark the millennium. And, I was involved in all aspects of working in a commercial nursery. In commercial terms, it was quite a small nursery, but still, quite a large-scale operation, collecting seed, growing trees, and then selling on those trees to the public and different organizations. And today's presentation really is me sharing some of that experience and knowledge on trees with particular focus on urban environments. So in terms of what we'll cover today, a bit about trees, some of the benefits of trees, particularly in urban areas, the process from collecting seeds right through to your trees for planting out, and then some focus on which trees are good in which areas, and then just some mention really of local initiatives and other info. So trees, just bring us back to basics. What are they? Well, trees are woody perennial plants that grow to considerable size. In terms of Britain and Ireland, how many tree species are native to Britain and Ireland? Well, it's not actually as easy as you might think to answer this question. Several factors. One, there's a bit of debate on what is native. There are different definitions, whether it's, following the last ice age and sea levels rose and we became two islands. Was that the point, or was it earlier or later than that? Or would have some species which are now naturalized in the UK and Ireland, such as sycamore, would they have arrived naturally, or they were introduced in Roman times, so considered naturalized? So again, that's one debate. And then there are, what is a tree, in terms of its size? Generally, anything over 6 meters is considered a tree, but some of that excludes some of the willow species, which can be lower growing, and I would certainly consider those to be tree species. And then there's also this question about, hybrids, or are they separate species? And in particular, whitebeam, which is a member of the rowan sorbus, the rowan family. There are lots and lots of specific, maybe considered individual species that you only find in a certain area. So again, it's I guess what is in a number, but it's certainly probably below 50 for Britain and Ireland. But worth remembering that the south of England will have more native species compared with, say, the far north and west of Britain or Ireland, where the weather or because of sea levels rose earlier across the Irish Sea, therefore it became separated sooner. So in terms of native species, there's certainly less than 50, which is less than the continent of Europe, and quite a low number compared to, say, North America, where you've got hundreds of native species. So in terms of percentage tree cover in Britain and Ireland, obviously through time that's changed. At one point, back thousands of years, much of Britain and Ireland would have been covered with woodland, with up to 80%. Only really the wettest and highest places wouldn't have had some sort of natural woodland cover, and obviously that picture has changed over time, as it has with many countries where woodland was cleared for agriculture and towns and cities. And not to say that that has changed more recently. Certainly in Britain, there was the post-war creation of the Forestry Service with a lot of planting, but mainly of kind of conifer species, particularly in upland areas. But then more recently, there's been a lot of initiatives to plant more trees, and certainly with things like climate change and carbon sequestration, there's been a lot of focus on trying to plant more native tree species for longer term benefit. That said, there have been other threats recently. Dutch elm disease obviously ravaged all of the mature elms really throughout England and Ireland, and a similar sort of thing potentially could happen with the ash dieback, which is obviously having a big impact. And then there's other species, other fungal diseases like sudden oak death, which is potentially threatening again this species. In terms of protection, within sort of an urban situation, tree preservation orders do exist, where there's local authorities can elect to preserve individual trees to prevent their prevent sort of people cutting them down or in fact pruning them without permission within conservation areas. If you're lucky enough to live within a conservation area, I mean, all trees above a certain size are protected regardless. And then obviously our protected areas, our national parks, our SSIs and sites of special scientific interest and otherwise will have a certain degree of protection for trees within that classification. In terms of benefits of trees, I mentioned already, climate change. Trees are increasingly being seen as a potential part of the solution to help manage the amount of carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere. Trees will take in a lot of carbon and store it in their woody stems, which if then turned into longer term objects like furniture or used in construction or whatever, then that carbon will be stored to a certain extent. Obviously, for cities in particular, trees provide quite a benefit in terms of the local environment. So they can provide shade, and because they're constantly cycling air and water, they will help to cool the local environment around where the trees are. There's also some research to suggest that planting trees can help to manage flooding. So a lot of our upland areas are covered with, don't have any sort of natural forests anymore on them. And there are some initiatives to replant some of those trees so that their soils, the deeper soils, but also the natural way that trees might fall across rivers and provide sort of natural dams and things like that, can help to slow down infiltration and reduce flood risk for downstream communities. Other benefits, trees are constantly taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, so obviously they're having some impact on local air, and also in terms of their surface area of their leaves, they can trap some of the particulates that's emitted from fires and from vehicles, etc. So can provide some benefit to air quality. Noise, again, because of the density of the leaves and the canopy, and they can provide some sort of buffering of sound by diffracting sound waves that are traveling in around cities. And certainly, in a city like Manchester, where there's a lot of cars, a lot of people, it's quite built up urban areas, and you've got quite hard surfaces. Planting trees can help to alleviate some of that noise. Obviously, trees provide a lot of benefit for wildlife, starting from the fungi and the insects which feed on the trees themselves, or the tree provides habitat for those, and then the whole food chain that really follows on from those invertebrates and fungi, and then which feeds all the birds, etc. An area where we're increasingly learning about is mental health and the value that green spaces and trees provide to mental health, whether that's providing areas for us to relax and enjoy and appreciate, through to just the aesthetic value that a tree can actually bring, and somebody can walk past it every day and make them smile. Just the fact that it's this huge, great thing that's been there for 100 years and has its its form and everything else, which gives people a certain sense of well-being. Trees can also provide food, particular orchards, pears and things like that, but also and some of the nuts, which hazelnuts, etc., and walnuts. So important source of food, and certainly lots of initiatives locally to plant trees for food production. Economy, trees obviously provide certain products like wood, and everything then that stems from harvesting that wood, it helps to contribute to the economy. And lastly, just to remember that trees are important in terms of our culture and arts and crafts, willow weaving and things like that, and making objects from wood, as well as folklore as well. I'm going to focus in a bit on growing trees from seed, and I'm just going to share with you some of my experience of that. I think the first thing to think about if you're thinking about growing trees is kind of what your ambition is, what you want to get out of at the end of it. Are you just looking to collect a few acorns, grow a few oak trees, and perhaps commemorate somebody's birthday with an oak tree that will then hopefully grow on to be a mature tree in hundreds of years time? Or are you thinking more about doing a small scale maybe nursery operation, an allotment or something like that, providing some some trees for tree planting to different community projects, or even for your own benefit. I think the first things to think about really are, where are you going to grow it? Are you going to grow it in ground, in a nursery type situation? You're going to need to maintain those plants in a similar way that you would with, any garden or vegetables. And then find, where these trees going to be planted. I think it's always good to have obviously an end point in mind. It takes a couple of years to really grow trees that are then suitable for planting out elsewhere. So I think it's planning that at the first stage. And as I mentioned, you can grow trees in a very small scale operation literally on your windowsill, ideally outside, but you can grow them inside as well. Or you can go obviously to the other end of the scale, which is sort of more commercial seed bed operation, which is where my experience was. And also the longevity of the project. Are you looking to just grow for a couple of years, or is it something you'd like to scale up and eventually do on a larger scale? So I'm just going to share my experience. I worked in a nursery. It was in terms of commercial scale of nurseries, it was fairly small scale, but nevertheless, it was a large Victorian wall garden. As I mentioned at the start, it was Conservation Volunteers Northern Ireland, which is now TCV, and we grew a lot of trees from native trees from locally collected seed. So seed we gathered from in around Northern Ireland, and then that seed was grown into trees, which were eventually sold on to the public, and in particular for organizations who wanted to plant local native trees from locally collected, local provenance seed in around Northern Ireland in particular. So just taking you through the process a bit more about growing trees. So the first stage is obviously collecting seed. Seed, I think we'll associate with is around the summer and the autumn time. So the first seeds to come out, things like elm that comes out quite early, and it sort of fruits, and then those seed actually disperse on the wind, and then they actually start growing immediately, and that's quite unusual for tree seed. Most seed overwinters and it starts germinating the following spring. And then obviously we've got our berries and our fruits like rowan and apple and stuff that come sort of in the summertime towards the autumn. Through to the main period being obviously the autumn time, when most of the the tree seed is like acorns and things like that, are dropped and either gathered by animals or dispersed on the wind. The two main strategies that trees have for dispersing their seed. Either animals collect them and bury them and hopefully forget about them, or they're dispersed on the wind and travel to different places. So timing is important when you're collecting seed. Depending on the type of seed you're collecting, it may be on the tree one day and sort of gone the next. And typically the autumn winds will play a large part in dispersing, the seed, sort of airborne seed. So it's important to think about that if you're planning to collect a lot of seed. Wildlife, if you ever collect hazelnuts, obviously the squirrels will play a key part in kind of foraging all the squirrels and burying them. So, good to obviously get out just before the main drop happens and, collect those from the trees themselves just before they fall. To think about permission, obviously if it's private land, you need to get landowner permission, or if you're collecting seed from protected areas, national parks, SSSIs, then you would need obviously the permission from the organization that is responsible for that particular area. At a local scale in a park or something like that, I mean, I don't really see the problem with collecting handfuls of seed. Strictly speaking, you probably should get permission, but I mean, I'm sure we're all we've all kind of walked along and picked up a few acorns. I mean, it's not really going to cause any damage doing that. In terms of useful equipment, you don't really need much, but depending on what seed you're gathering and the scale of what you're doing, you need to think about obviously containers, gloves, especially if you're picking some of the more prickly seed from the more prickly plants like hawthorn or blackthorn. And potentially secateurs if you're collecting bunches of seed, rowan berries, for example, which can also be pulled off. But I think, it's always good to take the seed carefully, because underneath where that seed has come from will be next year's fruiting buds, and you obviously don't want to pull off the fruiting buds, because that could impact on the ability of the tree then to produce seed the following year. How much to take? Well, again, it really depends on the scale of what you're doing. When I worked for TCV, we spent quite a few weeks of effort and large groups of volunteers going out collecting seed. Some things relatively easy. I mean, you could collect literally thousands, tens of thousands of birch seeds in an hour, or less than an hour, one person just pulling off, the tiny little winged seeds that grow in bracts. And if you pull the bract off, then, you've got thousands of seeds there. Whereas something like hazelnuts, particularly laborious process, because each hazelnut has to be found and then pulled off individually from the tree before, as I said, the animals get it. And it's worth bearing in mind that a certain percentage of that seed will not be viable. So again, and also, some trees will grow stronger than others just naturally. So it's always worth having, a little bit extra. But certainly wouldn't go out and take masses if you're not, you haven't got a final use for it. And obviously we need to leave enough behind for wildlife. Different types of seed. Some seed is dry and is best stored dry. Another seed, the majority, I'd say, of seed is best kept moist, but we'll go into a bit more detail on that. And I think just bearing this in mind, it's important to think about how you're going to store the seed before the treatment. So, for example, if you pick up some acorns, keeping those in the house in a heated house for a week or two, that seed is going to deteriorate. So it's worth bearing in mind if especially if you're hoping to grow a lot of trees, to make sure you treat your seed in the appropriate way. But here's a picture taken from TCV, which shows some seed collecting. The particular focus when I worked there was collecting from wild areas where you had more chance of collecting from trees which had grown in that particular area for forever really, and weren't planted. So we particularly sought out wilder areas in Northern Ireland where seed could be collected. And here you can see two volunteers collecting rowan berries from quite a steep-sided hill, has to be said. But luckily enough, it obviously does mean that the rowan berries are sort of around head height or easily accessible. There's again another picture from TCV which showing the hazel harvest. So there was quite a considerable afternoon of effort collecting all these hazelnuts from probably somewhere in around the glens of Antrim, where you've got extensive hazel woodland growing on, again, steep-sided valleys. It's the obligatory cup of tea and something sweet to go with to incentivize the volunteers when collecting. Next stage really is preparing the seed for sowing. As I mentioned, there are different types of seed, and those seed will need different types of treatment depending. So the first one really is the fleshy fruits. So things like apples, rowan berries, holly berries, anything with a fruit on it. Now that fruit is obviously designed to attract animals to take the fruit and then hopefully disperse the seed. So it's very important to remove that fleshy covering, because if you don't, then it'll kind of encourage rot, which could then impact on the viability of the seed. But it can also have chemicals inside the fruit which inhibit the germination of the seed itself. So best to take the fleshy covering off, and you can do that on a small scale, just rubbing it between your fingers, or if you have buckets of seed, then you can mash that up and sieve off or press it through a sieve if possible. Or I mean, there are various manuals which demonstrate this, but basically it's about getting rid of the fruity covering, and then filtering off the seed, which can float to the surface or sink depending on the type of seed, and then storing that seed in the appropriate way. The next type of seed is the nuts and the winged fruits. So things like acorns, hazelnuts are nuts. Winged fruit includes sycamore and ash, which disperse on the wing. And then with those is really just keep them moist. Don't let them dry out, but keep them cool as well, which is important. I think with all seed, really key focus, because they're summer, autumn time. It's getting cooler. Give them what they would have outside. Don't bring them into the house generally. Pods or cones bracts, so things like pine, birch, and the pods include things like broom. So again, these are slightly different in that you pick these early and then you keep them dry, so not wet and moist like many of the other things. And then as they dry out, they will release, they will break up. The pods of pine cones will open up and they'll drop the seed out. And then bracts will disintegrate and pods will also open. So this, if you've picked them too late, if you miss that window really, then they'll already have dispersed. So you have to pick those slightly early. And processing, well, we'll talk a bit more about how you process the seed. With some things like hazel and beech, if you put it in a bucket of water, the non-viable seed will float. But that's not always the case, but there is a certain amount of processing you can do once you've gathered your seed. So just some examples. This is obviously hawthorn berries, which is a great harvest here of berries, and inside each berry you'll have several seeds. And as I mentioned, this is the fleshy fruit which you need to get rid of before you extract the seed. These are cherry stones, so obviously with the fleshy cherry flesh removed. Hazelnuts. You don't need to remove them from their husks, which will rot off naturally. But again, this is an example of a nut which you would need to keep cool and moist. Ash, called keys, or the winged fruit from an ash tree. You don't need to remove the wing. The seed part is actually the part nearest the stalk, and again, needs to be kept cool and moist. And the last one are gorse. So these are the pods from gorse, which will once they're dry, they will open up and release the seed, which then you can store dry and sow in the spring. So in terms of treatment, one of the things with most tree species that will have some sort of inbuilt dormancy. Not every species, but most species, and this is really a strategy from trees to stop them germinating in a sort of warm autumn day, and then it's obviously suffering through the winter. So most species will need a period of cold before they will germinate. Best with all seed really is to keep it outdoors and expose it to the appropriate temperature winter. So if you can, it's appropriate, you sow your seed once you've gathered it, and keep it outside somewhere where it's protected from potentially squirrels or other animals which might be interested in a whole tray full of acorns, and make sure it gets that that exposure to the wind and the rain and the cold temperature to help break that dormancy. Now, what you can do if you're not ready to sow until the springtime is you can stratify that seed, which basically means mixing it with sort of compost sand mix and storing that in a cool place in a container. Again, making sure it's not too wet, but it's not too dry, and effectively that will provide the same conditions as if it was in a seed bed. It's exposed to the frosts, and it's getting that sort of helping to break down its dormancy period, so that come spring when you spread that seed out, then it's ready to germinate. Make sure you sow your seed before they start to grow. I've certainly experienced this where you're maybe stratified, your seed, you've stored it, and it's started to germinate in early spring before you manage to get in the seed bed. I just wanted to mention about oak that some species, as I mentioned, wych elm, but also oak will start germinating almost immediately. So if you've ever gathered acorns in the autumn time. You can see that they're already starting to put down a taproot. So again, with something like that, get it in the ground as soon as you can. So in terms of just generally about different species and the dormancy periods, as I mentioned, oak, elm, species that you would sow immediately. Some species which you would store dry and then sow in the springtime, such as alder and broom and gorse. Other species that have some sort of period that needs to be overcome, and you would then sow in the following spring, such as blackthorn, etc. And then some species, because they require a much longer period of cold before they'll germinate, generally speaking, what you would do with these is you would store them you would stratify them for 2 years, and then you would sow the following spring. So in particular, hawthorn, holly, yew, and ash. So there are ways and means that you can overcome this. You can store them in a fridge and increase that period of cold. Generally speaking, most stuff, if you're doing it on a small scale, get it in the ground as soon as you can, really. So in terms of sowing, it's important to, if you're stratifying your seed, check late winter, early spring, that it's, in case it starts to germinate. As I mentioned, it's the ideal time is just as the roots start to emerge. You can grow trees in all sorts of ways. You can put them obviously in seed beds or large containers, individual pots, even root trainers. The thing to think about though is the size of the seed will often the size of the pot. So if you're growing some very fine birch seedlings, for example, they could be a relatively small pot. Maybe you might grow a dozen or so, but you couldn't fit a dozen acorns in a small pot because they'd probably be quite crowded. How deep? As a general rule, as for most seeds, it's really the depth of the seed. So a tiny little birch seed, you just want to scatter on the surface and cover with grit or something like that, stop them blowing away. For oak, you would you plant them really the depth of the acorn or a bit deeper, really, because there's obviously a lot of stored energy in that acorn, which means it's got a lot, it can force its way to the top. I think the key thing with trees is that you don't want to be moving them while they're in leaf during the growing season. So you don't want to be repotting them. So really think about how big this tree is going to get in its first year, and keep it in that until the autumn time when it drops its leaves and you can safely move it. Also worth mentioning that you can grow quite a lot of plants from cuttings with no real need for rooting hormone. In particular, the willows and some of the poplar species grow well from cuttings, and they're really easy, to be honest. I mean, just my own experience really is, a few years back, I have an allotment in South Manchester, and I got a bundle of sticks in the post, which was I think it was 17 different varieties of willow from a local company, and so I had 3 sticks each, and each of those sticks was probably no bigger than a pencil, in terms of its length and width. In fact, some of them were a bit smaller than that, really. And so I prepared an area, probably only about 6 square meters, and planted these maybe about a foot or so apart. And then after, this is the 3rd year now. So in the first year, I got sort of a bundle of willow, say, sort of bucket size bundle of willow, some of them quite long, some of them a bit shorter. And this is what it looks like now. So you can see it grows. This has been cut down to the ground in the winter time, and it'll grow probably, some of the varieties will grow up to 10 foot just in one growing season. So this was last year's harvest. I don't actually have a picture of this year's, but you can see there's a number of different varieties with quite a variety of different colors. So this is last year's, and I'd say this year's harvest, or sorry, the harvest I've just taken was probably twice as much. So you can see in 3 years, from just a collection of sticks, really, you can have quite a lot of willow. And I will use this willow then for various projects, for basket weaving and things like that. Different species of willow have different characteristics, and some of them are better for weaving than others. But nevertheless, I just really like it for its aesthetic thing. And the great thing is, it's zero maintenance. I literally planted it through a membrane, or you could just heavily mulch the soil that you're planting through. And then there's no weeding involved, and all you have to do once a year is cut it down. It doesn't need any feeding or watering. It might benefit from the odd feed, but to be honest, it's done okay on an allotment site. So in terms of growing, sowing your seed and it's germinated. In terms of keeping those trees healthy, like any plants, they need obviously good light, moisture. If we've got a very dry spell, especially for young seed, you might need to water it. If they're hopefully not too densely planted, then you've got good airflow. Weeding can be quite important for young tree seeds, especially things like birch, which obviously take a while because they're such small seed to get going before they get their heads above the weeds. Weeding is something that maybe some people forget about, but that like all trees, if you just keep growing on the same soil, then you'll get deficiencies building up. So what you can do is you can feed the soil, which is either putting down a thick mulch of compost, or if you have access to compost, or even well-rotted manure. You don't want to make it overly rich, but you want to give good balance, obviously, of nutrients, that they're not going to be deficient in anything. Or you can do a liquid feed, or potentially broadcast some sort of feed. But it's speaking, on average soil, you should get decent results. With pests and diseases, obviously, if you're growing thousands and thousands of these, it might attract certain pests that particularly could cause some damage. But generally, by keeping them well watered, feeding them regularly, you should be okay. And what to expect? Well, depending on the species, depending on the conditions that you give it, you could get up to a meter's growth in a year from your trees. Generally speaking, trees from nursery stock, they're either 1 or 2, sometimes 3 years old. What happens in a commercial nursery is that the trees that you've planted in year 1, what you'll either do is you'll dig those trees up, you'll sort them into various sizes, and then you'll replant them. Or on a large commercial nursery, what they'll do is, assuming you've got a good, seed bed that's, you get your trees all nicely spaced and they've got enough space and to grow on for a subsequent year, then they'll undercut that, which effectively is dragging a blade underneath the ground, which severs the taproot. Now, the importance of that is it encourages then the tree to send out more fibrous root. If you don't move them, or if you don't cut that taproot, then you could have problems when you come to dig them up, because they've sent down a big long root with fibrous root at the end, and there's no way then you've got a very unwieldy tree for planting. So you want to kind of encourage that bushiness in a similar way that you would prune a tree to encourage bushiness. If you prune the roots, then it encourages branching of the roots, which gives you a better root system for when you come to plant it. So as I mentioned, you'd sort your species by height. You can then store those quite happily over the winter time by heeling them in. So you can bundle them together, put them in suitable compost, or a mixture of compost and sand, or even pure sand, and those will sit quite happily through the winter period. And as I mentioned, what we did on the nursery was we would dig up the trees that were 1 year old, we'd sort those, and then we'd line those out. So literally replant them at the right spacing for then growing on for another year, so that they'd be ready after that subsequent year for selling on. Note about growing in pots. Sometimes with all plants, the roots hit the edge of the pot and they'll just kind of swirl around. And important when you're growing trees, for planting out into larger trees, not to let that happen, because when it gets planted, then potentially those trees will keep going around in that circle and never really branch out. So it's important to tease the roots out, and don't be afraid to root prune to encourage that that more fibrous root system to develop. Here it's just a couple of pictures again from TCV. This case, these are probably hazelnuts which have been planted in several, there might be Actually, it might be alder, in fact, growing in several seed beds, which are then dug up, graded, and then sorted into bundles for either, in this case, selling or for lining out for planting again in late winter to grow on. So in terms of the next part of the presentation, really about what trees where, well, I think obviously there's a whole variety of native trees, naturalized trees, non-native trees, and really the ultimate size of those trees is generally with trees always encouraged to plant young, so nursery stock. So several advantages for doing that. It's much cheaper. When I worked in the nursery, we'd sell some trees for literally a couple of pence. Whereas if you're going to plant larger trees, which are necessary in some situations, then you're talking much more expensive, because those trees can be, sort of 10 years old, and obviously they've been nurtured for that amount of time. So there's obviously that additional cost involved. But generally speaking, if you plant them small, they're much more likely to adapt more quickly, and they can in fact catch up on some of the larger trees that are planted later on. But crucial with all trees, it really is about controlling the weeds, especially in the first couple of years until they get established. And once they're up and going, then they shouldn't need a lot of weed control. Key thing really is things like mulch. If you can mulch them, that really helps to avoiding things like strimming, which can damage the bark around the tree. Your soil, your site. I mean, Manchester's got a whole variety of different soils. I used to have an allotment in Levenshulme, and there was heavy clay there. And now where I am in South Manchester, it's pure sand, so it's a completely different world. And then there are parts of Manchester which obviously have more peaty soil as well. And different trees will respond to different soils. That some will prefer those sort of peaty soils, and others like wet, and others like dry. So think about all of those different aspects. Obviously exposure, depending on how high you are in terms of your aspect, then obviously different species will do better in those sort of situations. Go native. I think it's a good question. I think the mantra I've always been taught is native is better, but I think maybe we're rethinking that to some extent, because a lot of our native trees are threatened, and if we have a greater variety of species, then we've got greater resilience. So there's one argument. I think I also work with bees, a beekeeper, and in an urban area, because you've got such a variety of different pollination plants, most of which are not native at all to Britain or Ireland. There's a great variety of food source for the bees and for other insects. So I think, and let's face it, there's lots of really interesting tree species that come from all over the world, and I would certainly encourage people to grow and plant those as well. I think long term, obviously, trees are hopefully going to be there for generations. And then in particular, focus for urban environments, think about houses. You don't want to plant trees too close to houses. Services, if things like telegraph wires or electricity cables, also underground services, trees, shallow rooting species like cherry can be quite a problem, and getting into drains and things like that. But the right tree planted in the right situation, I mean, you can usually find a tree that will fit in your particular situation. Also think about neighbors, for longer term, if it's going to grow into a huge tree and cause confrontation with your neighbors. In particular, also for street trees, they tend to be planted quite large because of potential people vandalism and things like that. And then also, we've also just gone through a really dry spell, and things like climate change potentially means we've got more extremes, these sort of dry periods of drought, but also periods of wetter periods as well. So think about how we're going to maintain these trees into the future. So this isn't obviously a definitive guide, but I thought it might stimulate a bit of debate, hopefully. So here are just some examples. So trees for wet places we would associate with wet places, things like the alder, obviously the willows, bird cherry, downy birch. Again, then trees for dry places, silver birch, or some of the more hardy southern European species, might be worth planting. Orchards and edible fruits, but obviously we've got all of our our autumn harvest type stuff like apples and pears, but also things like walnuts. I don't know if you've ever gathered walnuts. It's probably a bit too far north up here, but they do fruit. Hazelnuts, certainly gathered hazelnuts. For small gardens, rowan, grafted fruit trees, anything that's not going to grow too large. Large stately trees, obviously the oak and the ash, sycamore, horse chestnut. Trees for climbing. I mean, lots of trees species here, but one in particular that obviously I'm fond of is oak. Might put cedar of Lebanon or something like that in there. As I mentioned about trees for weaving, so we got if you're thinking of growing trees for that, then obviously willow. And you can get lots and lots of different varieties of willow, and some of them specifically designed for weaving. Trees for their autumn color. Again, you could put lots in here, but the acers in particular, the maples. Again, hundreds of species of maple, which can provide a fantastic autumn color. Trees that will outlive your great grandchildren. Well, some of our oldest trees in Britain and Ireland are the yews, thousands of years old, and some again, large oaks as well. Big city trees. I mean, I think many of our cities would look very different without London plains. These grow to enormous trees and provide real character in cities like London. Trees for noise reduction. I think you could probably have a long list here, but I think any hedging or anything which is quite dense and provides that kind of buffering effect for noise. Trees for birds, for roosting and nesting. Again, anything that's quite dense. My neighbor has a plum tree in his back garden, and it's got to be one of the best trees I've ever seen for birds because it's so dense. When it flowers, the pigeons are on it, and the bullfinches, and then the fruit, and it provides a real amazing habitat really for birds, which obviously needs somewhere safe to shelter. And then trees for wildlife. Well, anything and everything. Let's not limit ourselves. So lastly, just to mention a couple of local initiatives. TCV, based in Manchester, and they do lots of practical stuff with trees, hedge laying, and practical skills. City of Trees is again another organization, and they're very much involved in tree planting. And I think we've got someone on the webinar from Forest Garden Group, Birchfields Park. But there are many, many more, and lots of different opportunities if you're interested in getting involved in trees and growing trees and planting trees locally. And lastly, just wanted to mention sources of info. This is just one example. This is a Autumn Seed Harvest Handbook from TCV, which I've used some of the information in here to help deliver the presentation today. So that brings us on to the questions. Over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you, Paul. That was really good and really thorough, and hopefully is a bit of inspiration for people for getting grown at home. One from Monica, though. She says, how cold is cold for keeping over winter? She has an outhouse at around 7 degrees in the winter. Is that okay, or do they have to go below freezing?
I think generally if you can keep them outside, that's fine. If it's an honest store them, probably best to try and keep them cooler than 7 degrees, because I assume that outhouse might have some insulation or something, which means it's not quite as cool as it would be outside.
I was wondering where you bought all your willow cuttings from.
Right, I got those from Yorkshire willow.
Okay.
But I mean, if people are interested, I'm more than happy to pass on some cuttings for if in the autumn time, because stem, you could cut that into 10 pieces and there's 10 new plants. So yeah.
Amazing. It took really lovely colours anyway.
Yes.
Nice pictures. Yeah.
If you cut it every year, then that new growth will be quite vivid. If you let it kind of grow, then the color tends to be just on the newer growth at the tips.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you know of any good tree nurseries? I know that I know we're talking about growing from seed, but if people want to buy saplings, we've bought before from Ashridge Trees. They sell a lot of native trees, but they're in the southwest, so I don't know if you know of any maybe up this end.
To be honest, no, I don't. I haven't really
Mhm.
investigated that carefully in the local area, but I'm sure if you got in touch with some of the organizations like TCV which do tree planting, then they might be able to recommend. So I think it's just finding them out, and getting in touch with them early. Don't expect them to have what you want towards the end of winter, because obviously they might be growing, for a particular purpose, and they might need a bit of a lead in, especially if you want a lot of trees.
Yeah, something to note is that the Woodland Trust do free tree packs. I don't know which groups have accessed this, but they do them free for schools and community groups. And we've had quite a few before, and they're all native species, and they do specific packs for hedgerows and copses, wild harvest, working wood, wild, even urban trees I see here actually. So so they tend to you have to get them in touch with them early in the year, or I mean around about now, and they either give them out in November or in March. You'll get a big box of them, so they're good. And they'll also send through rabbit guards and bamboo sticks. So
great. Yeah.
So a couple of questions have come up. Natalia says a question about feeding. As far as I know, there are two options: slow release fertilizer applied twice a year, or frequent liquid feed. Do you prefer one over the other?
No, I think as long as you've got, you're giving plants that's those nutrients when they need it. So that's during the growing season, and you're obviously not over applying, which can leach out into the water courses and stuff. I think either is fine. Slow release, probably a bit less labor intensive, whereas you might need to do liquid feed several times during the year. You're growing on a relatively rich soil, though you probably don't need to worry about it in the first year if you've got.
Would you say it's kind of in response to if you see any problems with the trees as well? If discoloration of leaves and lack of growth or fruiting.
Yeah, you obviously want to get in before that happens, but they do obviously need good balance of nutrients, and I think drought stress as well. If you let your trees dry out, and I suppose especially applicable if you're growing them in pots, can obviously quite hinder them in terms of their growth. So it's not always a sign that it's they're lacking in nutrients. It could be other factors as well.
Yeah, also asks whether there are trees that don't mind having branches cut for display, for example, for displaying a vase at home. And she says, I suppose willow because it grows fast and doesn't mind cutting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of species will be absolutely fine. To be honest, when trees are young, you can prune them quite happily, and most of them will regrow. I mean, classic ones are hazel as well, which can be cut right down to the ground every year. Of years, you can do it every year, but people do it every other year, and then they harvest the long straight stems which come off for various purposes. Back in the day, we used to build, walls with them, but these days I guess people use them for things like growing their beans and things like French beans.
Monica says she's grown 4 Italian stone pines from seed.
Wow.
She's hoping she can offer them to a local park eventually. And she says, have you any experience of them in a public space in this climate? Do you know this kind of pine?
I don't know it actually. What was it? A stone pine?
Italian stone pine.
Italian stone pine? No, I don't know what species of pine that is. No.
Hmm. Do you have much experience with pines and like, conifers? Things?
Just with well, a couple. I mean, obviously, our native conifers is probably only 2 or 3 of them. Scots pine, juniper, yew, I guess, falls into that category as well.
Mm.
But I mean, yeah, I don't have a huge amount of experience, but they're all. At the end of the day, they're all. I guess if you give them the right conditions, then I don't see why they wouldn't grow successfully,
Mm-hmm.
and the right soil
And
type.
they're good, aren't they? Because they're known for being great for carbon sequestration because they grow so fast.
Well, not all. I mean, not
Well,
all.
some of them do. But
Not all pine species.
yeah.
I mean, I think people generally think of the plantations of conifers in our uplands, and a lot of that will be things like Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, which are Scandinavian or North American species, which grow really fast in the UK and Ireland because they're we've got milder climate. That's a lot of rain, whereas our native Scots pine. I mean, they're not a very fast growing species, especially I imagine Southern European pine species. They're probably quite like dry, quite hot conditions, cold winters as well. So I guess it depends. If you're going to plant them in a waterlogged soil, they might not do so well. So I guess it's just find out what they want, what they like, and there's lots of resources online which should help to give you that information.
I think earlier someone was talking about do you have any books and things that you'd recommend? I have a really great it's not about growing trees, but I have the Collins Complete Guide to British Trees, which is a really nice book. Loads of lovely pictures, and it's a really good ID book for trees in the UK. Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think any of it depends what you're interested in, but if you're great books on huge veteran trees, Thomas Pakenham produced a book on meetings with remarkable trees, with charting some of the the ancient trees in around Britain and Ireland.
That's about us then. Anything sort of final thing to say, or
no?
all talked out.
All talked out, yeah. So
yeah.
Thanks very much for listening, and I wish you all success if you're going to get involved in growing and planting trees.
Yeah, much, Paul, and thanks everyone for logging in. And maybe we'll see you next week on our vermiculture and compost webinar. Okay, cheers everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.